Everybody, my name is Misha Fisher. For those of you I haven't met, this is research Peter and I have co-authored together. I want to set up first the research question. Specifically, we wanted to know what is the impact of occupational licensing restrictions on market clearing in the digital economy. And this ties in well to the previous panels where we were talking about new ways we can glean insights from high frequency, large volumes of data. And in this case, we're specifically measuring the market clearing by the supply and demand imbalance between consumers who are demanding home services and skilled trades professionals who are available to do the work. I'm going to dive into that a little bit more after I sort of give some important nods to the motivation for this from other research outlets out there. This is, I think, something that most people are aware of at this point, given the recent push by the White House in terms of trying to raise awareness around occupational licensing as a labor market restriction. And Kleiner and Kruger have some of the research out there on that front showing that licensing impacts about 1 in 5 Americans. Blair and Chung have research on the negative impacts of the labor supply in terms of survey data. Ferranato and others have, as well as Hall, have research showing that there's no improvement in quality. And then Farrell and others have digital marketplaces growing to capture more and more of this. And again, this is sort of where it really ties into the earlier discussion about ADP and LinkedIn and other platforms. So setting up our platform specifically, many people have heard of Angie's List. Angie is the recently rebranded company. We are now Angie.com. One of the main sources of volume is the Home Advisor platform. Some people may know the Home Advisor name itself or have seen the advertising on television. And what we effectively did was we set up a proprietary data set of internal administrative data that builds the supply-demand function in real time that shows consumer data in terms of requests coming in to have work completed and whether or not it is being matched to professionals on the other side of it. We have roughly 20 million observations for 2019 that covers the full year. We specifically exploit state variation in licensing, which Peter Blair will talk a little bit more about, but we do this in a couple different ways. And the key result, the big takeaway, is that we found licensing increases the supply-demand imbalance by roughly 14 percentage points, which is a roughly 24% increase in the overall effect. So it's a pretty sizable impact on the overall marketplace. The effect is also exacerbated in rural and suburban geographies that have lower population density. Transitioning into what the market looks like, this is just a quick primer on how we view it. The market overall, there's about 141.5 million existing housing structures that are out there. These are frequently the largest and most important assets everybody holds. This is also where we live, so they're deeply personal spaces, and growing importance and focus on things like happiness and health and satisfaction. Of course, all of that requires that consumer demand to be met. The market is a completely national market, just like the platform. We've got data for all 50 states and very high volumes of it for the most part. In terms of the service professionals who do this, there isn't a good consensus number. Our estimate is about 5.7, 5.8 million service professionals who work in this. There are some confounding variables in terms of trying to measure specifically how people move between existing residential, new construction, commercial work. These things aren't perfectly well understood, but our estimate's about 5.8 million people who are doing this. So it's a pretty sizable labor force, and it's a sizable labor force with a pathway to the middle class. It doesn't require a college degree typically. Of course, there are licensing restrictions in some of these cases, but not necessarily in all of them, and we're exploiting that variation. With that sort of setup on the market overall, which again we estimated is about 595 billion in consumer spending in 2021, which again is pretty large, I want to show you a little bit of background about how the data is being generated and how we're capturing it. So roughly what this looks like is a service request comes in from a consumer, and the task that they're interested in having completed could be licensed or it could be unlicensed. It depends on the geography and the task. And there's some tasks that might be licensed in all geographies, some that might be licensed in none, but many have that variation that we can exploit in our causal design. That comes into the platform. The platform is both an app or a web browser. There's even call centers that can that can also do it, but most of the volume comes from the app and the web browser. That is then matched to service providers, which is the supply side of the market. And there can be service providers who are either interested in accepting this demand or they may not be. And that's the part that we're trying to look at in terms of how the licensing impacts the probability of that accept. Putting this into sort of concrete visuals, this is roughly what it looks like when you go onto the Home Advisor platform and look at what is a primary work category. This is how the tasks themselves are bucketed. So they're bucketed by work categories like cleaning or plumbing or additions and remodels. And then from there, a pathway nests people down to a specific task level observation of what the work is. And there's over 500 of those discrete task types. So you can see if you were to click on plumbing, then go over there, you can see that there's all these different types of plumbing that you can go into. And within each one of those, there may be further nesting. The trees are not necessarily uniformly shaped. Some might push you down into only a couple of tasks. Others might have a dozen or more. And that sort of sets up the background for the market and the overall experimental design and approach. And Peter's going to walk through roughly how we set things up and the exploitation that we could do of this data. Because it's national, because there's so much of it, we were able to exploit multiple sources of empirics. So I'll pass it over to Peter. Peter, I think you're muted.
All right, Misha, thank you so much for the great setup. There are going to be three main ways that we're going to try to identify the impact of occupational licensing on labor market, on market clearing in this context. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to exploit the cross-sectional variation in licensing requirements for these various tasks across states using a linear probability model. Then we're going to move to a boundary discontinuity design, which is going to tighten the identification assumption. What we're going to be able to do is to zoom in on counties that share a state border and exploit the plausibly exogenous variation in licensing requirements across state borders within a similar labor market. Within that context as well, we're going to be able to estimate heterogeneity in the impact of licensing on different types of counties based on the demographic characteristics of those counties, but also based on the housing supply in those counties as well. And we're going to close out our study by focusing on a specific case study of New Jersey, where in 2019, the state of New Jersey required that pool contractors had to have a license. And so in that case study, we're going to leverage the temporal variation in the licensing regime before and after in New Jersey, but then also cross-sectionally with other states as well. So starting off with our OLS estimates, we're going to regress a dummy for whether or not a given service request R for a specific task T in state S for in month M is accepted by a service professional on whether or not that task is going to be licensed. And so that's the indicator L subscript TS. And so our coefficient of interest is going to be beta, which is going to capture the extent to which occupational licensing at the task level is going to reduce market clearing on average. We're also going to include task fixed effects, which is going to allow us to make comparisons of the same task, but in different contexts where that task is licensed versus not. And we're going to include also month fixed effects and state fixed effects as well. I want to draw your attention to the specification in column 4, which is going to be our most stringent specification, where we're going to include task fixed effects, state fixed effects, and month fixed effects. And what you can see here is that when a task is licensed, that's going to reduce the likelihood that the market clears by about 12 percentage points. That's off of a base of about 60%. And so this impact is going to be roughly about a 20% increase in the supply-demand imbalance. When we move to the boundary discontinuity design, we're going to be augmenting the linear probability model in two ways. The first is we're going to restrict the sample to only those counties that share a state border with another county in a different state. That's going to allow us to leverage the plausibly exogenous variation in licensing laws, but within the same labor market. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to add in these boundary dummy pairs. That's going to absorb some of that local variation. When we implement our boundary discontinuity design in our most stringent specification, where we're identifying variation in licensing at the task level, but across state boundaries, we're going to find an even larger impact of occupational licensing on supply-demand imbalances, than we found in the OLS. Here, we're going to find that licensing is going to reduce the likelihood that a service request is met by about 14.5 percentage points. So this is up from the 12.3 percentage points that we estimated in the OLS specification. So if anything, just naive cross-sectional regressions are going to give us estimates of the negative impact of licensing on labor market clearing that are going to be too conservative. Next, what we do is we draw in demographic characteristics of the various counties to test whether distributional impacts of licensing. Do we find, for example, that licensing has more negative impacts in areas where there's a higher or lower population density, richer or poorer areas, places where there's a higher or lower share of minorities? We're also going to look at the stock and the quantity of the housing. We're going to also look at the quality and the quantity of the housing stock in a census tract as well. And so we're going to construct standardized measures of both these demographic characteristics and these supply characteristics, and we're going to interact them with our licensing dummy, and we're going to control for them directly as well to estimate the distributional impacts of occupational licensing. For this specification, we're going to focus again on the sample of counties that are in those border counties. And so as we go across these columns from 1 to 3, in the first specification, we're going to have no fixed effects. In the second column, we're going to have state, month, and task fixed effects. And in the final column, we're going to have the boundary fixed effects in addition to the other fixed effects. What's the key takeaway from this slide? So if we look at the county that's at the absolute average across all of these various characteristics, we're going to find that licensing is going to reduce the likelihood of market clearing by about 18.2 percentage points. Focusing in on the heterogeneous impact of population density on licensing, what we find is that in places that are going to be less dense, that's going to further exacerbate the negative impact of licensing on the supply-demand imbalances. So if, for example, you move from a county that's at the average of the population density to a county that's 1 standard deviation below, you're going to have an increase of about 5 percentage points in the amount of supply-demand imbalance, or that's going to be a reduction of about 30% in the likelihood that that service request is going to be met. In fact, it's only households in the top 0.2% of the population density distribution that have like a non-negative impact of licensing. Finally, we're going to exploit variation coming from a change in law in the state of New Jersey in January of 2019, where all tasks in the pool primary work categories contractors were required to have a license. And we're going to do 2 comparisons here. The first comparison is going to be comparing the accept rate in New Jersey before and after with all other states as controls. The second comparison we're going to do is a pairwise comparison where we're going to allow each other state in the US to be a control state for New Jersey. Here's the results for the overall study. Looking again in column 4, we can see that the impact of licensing on labor market clearing in New Jersey, again, looking at the pooled primary work category, it's going to decrease the likelihood of that happening by about 10 percentage points off of a base of about 40 percentage points. And so again, this is around an effect size of about 20%. And when we look at the state level pairwise diff and diffs, we can see that the average effects that we were estimating are not going to be driven by one state in particular. This dashed line here is going to represent the median of each of these state by state comparisons. And so for 39 out of the 50 states, we're going to find that there's a negative impact of licensing on labor market clearing using this specific case study. And it's only in the remaining 11 that you see positive effects. In conclusion, there are a couple of clear headlines. So the first is that occupational licensing is going to increase the supply-demand imbalance by about 14 percentage points, or about 24% in online marketplaces. And this is going to be a very robust finding that we see across various different specifications that exploit different sources of variation within the data. And we can do this because we have such a large sample of data that's nationally representative, and we have so many observations. These estimates are going to be very similar to the estimates that exist in the literature when you look at offline marketplaces and you look at survey data. Those estimates are going to be focusing mostly on the impact of licensing on the supply margin, whereas in this context, we're going to be looking at market clearing like more broadly. We know from Chiara's other work that licensing a profession is not going to improve customers' valuation of that profession too. And so in many ways, like the welfare consequences of this are potentially pretty dire. Not only does licensing reduce the market size, but in this particular context, it could also result in deferred maintenance on homes rather, which is a very important asset class, and also the utility that households get from living in their dwelling place and increasingly working in their dwelling place as we move more towards remote work. There's tremendous amount of interest in thinking about how deregulating occupational licensing could spur labor market dynamism. And we think about this work as showing that not only might this be the case in offline settings, but also in online settings too. Thank you very much. And we look forward to Chiara's discussion and to your questions.
Great, thank you. You were right on time, so that's terrific. So we'll circle back in the discussion, and there's a few questions in the chat as well you might want to take a look at. So Helen, please take it away.